여러분 안녕하세요.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And welcome to the third day, the third session of the 2020 Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage. I will be your mistress of ceremonies for today. I'm Mokseon Jeonju MBC. This forum is being broadcast live on ICHCAP Jeonju MBC and Cultural Heritage Administration's YouTube channel and Naver TV, as well as the forum's official website. I'd like to ask all of our audience members for their continued participation. The World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage was held under the theme of ICH in Cities in 2017, ICH in Peace in 2018, and ICH in Civic Life in 2019. This year, the 2020 World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage is held under the theme of Human, Nature, and Intangible Cultural Heritage. Over the last 2 days, we've had the opportunity to look at redefining relationships between humans and nature, as well as overcoming the crisis through intangible cultural heritage. Today is our third and final session, and today we will be hearing a special lecture from Dr. Michael Mason, who is the director of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. We do have experts from US, Latvia, and Philippines to speak to us today, as well as students from the Korean National University of Cultural Heritage. Please make use of the comment section on the YouTube channel as well as the forum's website to provide us with any questions or comments, and we'll make sure that they will be included as part of our panel discussion. Through this forum, I hope that we can all have the opportunity to discover the vision and values for environmental sustainability that ICH can offer. And with that, we would like to begin the third session of the 2020 World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage. First of all, I would like to invite Dr. Michael Mason of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage to provide us with a lecture on role of communities in promoting environmental sustainability and intangible cultural heritage.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I appreciate the invitation to share my perspective on this important theme. I'll begin by acknowledging that I am in Washington, D.C. on the traditional lands of the Piscataway people whose ancestors, elders, and young people I honor. By extension, I also honor all the indigenous people who may be with us today. I want to thank the World Forum for its invitation, and I want to acknowledge the team there as well, who've done a great job preparing us all with great patience across many time zones to have a really interesting conversation. Your tranquility and humor and good-natured acceptance of our arriving late, fumbling with technology and the like is much appreciated. Finally, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage who work every day to increase the understanding and sustainability of intangible cultural heritage across the United States and around the world. Without them, I would not be able to be with you today, and I would have many fewer interesting things to share. So I'm going to give you an overview of my presentation today. I'll give you a short introduction with some framing concepts. I'll run through two examples of strong community-based interventions that blend issues of intangible cultural heritage and environmental sustainability. I'll then lay out our approach of cultural sustainability with the idea that we can abstract out of these two cases this approach that we're using quite universally at this point. So with that, I'll dive right in. The center, just for the record, is dedicated to increasing understanding, strengthening communities, and reinforcing our shared heritage, our shared humanity. We do that through the power of culture and specifically through the power of ICH. And we've been at this for more than 50 years with an incredible and diverse group of professionals. Obviously, this is a group of specialists that I'm speaking with, and so I don't need to run through all of the details around intangible cultural heritage, but it is important, I think, to remind us all that we're talking about an enormously broad set of phenomena, from handicrafts and visual arts to abstract knowledge practices concerning nature and the universe and everything in between. I bring that up just because I think in our world, we're quite used to this incredible breadth of material. And many of our colleagues, when we speak outside of our smaller circles of intangible cultural heritage, are less prepared for that, the vastness, let's say, of that body of material. It is rather remarkable to assert that there are commonalities across this vast array of social practices. And I think, well, I think that that's it is true that there are continuities. It's something that I think we need to consistently communicate when we try to speak outside of our immediate discipline. I should also say that we always talk about intangible cultural heritage, and of course, we all also know that the ICH convention states very clearly that the convention also addresses the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated with ICH. And those cultural spaces are frequently natural spaces. And I think that is a very natural point of intersection, if you will allow the pun. So this image is a rice paddy in Bhutan, and it shows a person praying at a chorten, and that's a very common practice, that there's a small shrine or temple in the middle of a rice field that people use on their way to work in the fields, on their way back, or they might just go there because they wish to pray. I'm going to change my focus now to Kenya and talk about the South Rift Association of Landowners, which I'll refer to as my colleagues there do as Saralo. Saralo is an NGO that was created a few years ago in the South Rift. It represents about 18,000 Maasai people in the communities there. And it was started really with the goal of improving the lives of community members. And that has led them naturally into work related to various kinds of biodiversity conservation, and also into ICH preservation work. So their work really began with the creation of a community conservation enterprise. Bannock is a community conservancy rather, where local people are working as scouts, as game wardens, surveying to make certain that poachers are not coming in and killing animals, and also as guides to visitors. And this is an image of a space that they have at a camp just outside the conservancy, where they host visiting groups so that they can learn about these conservation efforts. And before COVID, they were consistently hosting groups from all over the world. There's one physical structure here, and the rest of the space is actually a campground, so that the impact is quite light on the environment itself. I've had the good fortune to stay at this wonderful camp, and it's truly remarkable to spend the night there, because you can hear as predators move through the landscape and they wake up the other animals. It's really a wonderful way for people to get to know the landscape and the natural world there in the South Rift. After a number of years, Saralo decided that they would begin a Maasai heritage program to gather material, cultural art and traditional knowledge for an interactive cultural museum and an annual festival. Again, this is with the goal of improving livelihoods consistently. And that's incredibly important. This work was undertaken, as I said, by Saralo, and really was launched by a significant amount of community engagement. Some of it quite formal, with formal consultation meetings in different parts of the community, but of course, much of it informal, as community political processes always are. In 2013, Saralo mounted the first cultural festival. They chose a location at the north end of the area where they work, because it is most accessible to the roads and the parts of population centers in Kenya. And so it's also adjacent to a museum, National Museums of Kenya site. So there's some infrastructure already there that they were taking advantage of. In 2014, Saralo participated at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, and we actually returned an object that was in our collection to the community. You see in the center of this screen some of the leaders of Saralo at the moment that we returned this object. And I should just acknowledge that my friends at Saralo have had a back and forth with us, and the Smithsonian has supported their work intermittently. This is very much their endeavor, not ours. But because of our consistent engagement, I feel comfortable explaining it to you all. If you'd like to learn more, please reach out to me and I can connect you to the leaders of Saralo, including John Kamanga, who you see here in the middle with the red, white, and blue scarf. I move now to Southern Europe, or as my friends in Catalonia say, the northern part of Southern Europe, or the southern part of Northern Europe. The Val d'en Bas is a municipality of some 3,000 people in Catalonia, which many of you will think of as northeastern Spain. This picture was taken when, at the end of a weekend of returning the findings of a significant cultural mapping exercise that we undertook. And many of the people who were involved are in this picture. I'll just draw your attention to the bearded gentleman in the front, in the center. He is the mayor of the Val d'en Bas, who invited us to come work. Just on one side of him, in the pink pants, was the project coordinator and my research partner, Marichel Martini Pardo. And to his left, to his right on the screen, are a number of the students who we trained to help with the cultural mapping. Again, I call out individuals because so much of this work really does depend on the actions of individuals organizing their communities. Over the course of a summer, about 10 weeks, we interviewed 40% of the adult population of the Val d'en Bas, with more than 600 interviews, more than 800 hours of interviews. We were able to create a very clear sense of those issues and those aspects of ICH that really mattered to this community. We did this at the mayor's invitation, as I said, precisely because we wanted to help the community understand what it cared most about, so that we could then work with them to make a plan for managing that ICH and their larger cultural life going forward. We found three really important concepts that were shared across the population, regardless of age or gender, or whether folks were from this community and had lived there their whole lives, or whether they were relative newcomers. And those are some of the ways in which that community breaks down. One of the key things that everybody talked about was the social values of togetherness, of being good neighbors, of participating in social life. And so here, I just got an image of people dancing the sardana, which is a traditional folk dance that has been a major part of Catalan life for the last 100 years, and which remains a key expression of cultural identity in Catalonia, especially for folks, I would say, over 35. It's an incredibly intricate and slow circle dance that can expand to include any number of people. So a second major area was the focus on the landscape and on rural life. The Val d'en Bas is literally a valley community, and you see here the remains of a volcano and a field. These are two of the key defining aspects of the landscape there. It's incredibly important to people. They talk about the landscape. They talk about the importance of rural life. Whether that's farming per se, or whether that's working with animals, there's a real understanding that these are key aspects of who this community is and that they care passionately about. That is, using the language of the ICH Convention, this forms a part of their identity. This is, of course, complicated because the landscape in modern Europe is not controlled by any single entity. And so the community itself has to really work to sustain the landscape as they understand it in the face of many political forces, including some that are focused on development. And there was a major infrastructure project that began it began longer ago than that opened 8 years ago, and it continues to this day, that is a source of incredible concern for this community. Related to this focus on the landscape as a key aspect of cultural heritage for folks in the Val d'en Bas, there's a very strong hiking tradition, and there's an association called ICHCAP, which is an excursionist or hiking club that is one of the most active cultural associations within the Val d'en Bas. They organize several hikes every year. Some of them are focused more exclusively on natural heritage. Some of them bring together natural and cultural heritage. But the idea that you have an NGO that is organized to do this work consistently, and that hiking itself is a cultural tradition that relates people over and over again to the landscape is really interesting. I should also just say, it's important to understand that in Catalonia, there's a strong tradition of building NGOs, what they call associationism, that has been a response to generations of political marginality and challenges. And that is borne out in the Val d'en Bas, which, as I said, has about 3,000 inhabitants. There are more than 50 formal NGOs engaged in cultural and social life there. And there are others that are not formalized. So you're talking about an enormous amount of volunteer cultural activity, which is really astounding, even for an American like me, where volunteerism is a major part of our cultural life. I want to say that as part of this mapping project, we identified that springs, water sources, are in fact an important cultural site in the Val d'en Bas. This is really significant because with global warming, the climate, there's less water than there used to be in the Val d'en Bas. And so these spaces, which were used as recreational spaces, as social meeting spaces, as performance spaces for music and dance, are less and less accessible. People used to go to swim and engage in other activities, and that's no longer possible. And we're working with the regional ICH authority, which is the Director General of Popular Culture and Cultural Associationism of the regional government of Catalonia, on an ICH inventory, since that is an important expression of their work. And we included an entire entry in that inventory about springs. So we're really looking at the natural landscape as one of these sites where important cultural activity happens, although it's happening less and less, as I said. Similarly, you see this worm in the center, or caterpillar in the center of this image. There's a particular moth that is destroying all of the boxwood trees in the region. It's a new arrival it's an invasive species from another part of the world. And boxwood was used traditionally in a huge number of material culture expressions in the Waldenbos. And because the wood is now increasingly scarce, there are controls on how much of it people can use, and that's threatening those traditions. So we're looking at climate change really impacting the way in which this community is continuing its ICH. And we, as I said, are there to work with the community to help them make a plan for moving forward. And I won't go into the specifics of that project itself, but I want to talk about our larger model of cultural sustainability, and the Waldenbos project is one example. So for us, as we understand cultural sustainability, it's a reciprocal research practice, meaning that the research goals are clearly identified in collaboration and communication with the community. There are four key aspects to the way we understand and practice cultural sustainability. It fosters relationships, it engenders knowledge about the community and the environment in which it exists. Cultural sustainability guides diverse ethical interventions that are designed to enhance the vitality of the specific community and their specific ICH expressions. I think that's important. A colleague of mine has suggested that this is in fact radical because we're not focusing only on the expressive lives and the ICH and the preservation of those things, but we're really acknowledging that our primary focus is on the well-being of the community. And as I said at the beginning, our work is about strengthening communities in part. And so that's key for us. Finally, we consistently engage in monitoring and evaluation to ensure that we're having the kinds of impacts that we want. My colleague Rory Turner and I recently published a short article about defining cultural sustainability and laying this out in more detail. That was published in the Journal of American Folklore in January of 2020, and I shared it with the organizing committee, so it should be widely available at this point. I should say that we do benefit from the ecological model that Hout Schippers and Catherine Grant and their team came up with in their Sustainable Futures for Music Cultures project, looking at 5 different domains that drive the sustainability of particular forms. What that really does is it allows us to think very creatively and very specifically about the sociocultural environment and the ways in which it is impacting the vitality of particular forms. So as I said, just to use one example, the infrastructure and regulations, the domain of infrastructure and regulations in the Waldenbos is having a significant impact on these material culture traditions that use boxwood, because it is now not legal to harvest boxwood. Similarly, our work around training young cultural heritage professionals, I think, changes the context, to use another example, because we've really, the project itself and these young practitioners that we've engaged are transforming the way in which the community itself understands the importance of ICH. So how does this work in practice? This is our process. I want to be very clear that it's rarely as linear as this image makes it look, but it is quite consistent for us. The process always begins with relationships. It moves to specific research and documentation efforts. In the Waldenbos example, obviously that's the cultural mapping at this point. There's a community visioning process that varies from place to place, but is also consistently part of our work. In the Waldenbos example, the picture that you saw at the beginning with everybody who, many of the people who worked on the project, was from a key moment of community engagement where we were returning the findings of that cultural mapping exercise to the community over a course of a weekend with multiple community meetings, formal and informal opportunities to gather and discuss what we had learned. And the goal is then to turn that into community projects, the next step, which are the specific efforts to address specific ICH forms, and then the evaluation process, which of course has to be built into the whole thing. So it could also be a continual arrow, because you have to know what you're going to evaluate at the beginning to evaluate it effectively. I want to stress at the bottom of this slide, you see that community engagement is happening throughout. And I want to stress that again, because it is so very important. Community engagement in this case includes individual conversations, community meetings, email flyers, bulletins, a huge range of, I should also say, media stories in newspapers and on the radio and on local television. So there's an enormous amount of outreach to the community so that everybody knows that the process is happening and knows really clearly when and where they can engage. So that's, as I said, a highly idealized vision of how the process unfolds. This is a picture just to underscore community engagement. Again, these are a number of the students who we trained and helped us with the cultural mapping project in the summer of 2019, an effort that would be impossible under the current circumstances with COVID, because they went out and met with 600 people. So that is the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for your time. You can learn more about our work at folklife.si.edu, and you can email me at masonem@si.edu with any questions. Thank you again to the World Forum for the opportunity to share my thoughts about the role of communities.
Michael Mason, Smithsonian.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Michael Mason, the director of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Now we're going to take a short break and then go to the last session of the event, which is titled Intangible Cultural Heritage in Our Daily Lives and Towards a New Age. I ask for your patience. Thank you. Now let's begin session 3 on the topic of intangible cultural heritage and our daily lives towards a new age. This session will be moderated by Yoon Jin, who is the president of the Cultural Foundation of National Museum of Korea. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. As was introduced, I'm Yoon Jin. Especially in this year of 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think online or virtual world has now just become a new normal. Actually, all the national museums have had to close down as well. Actually, so the only way of communicating with the audience, we have an online museum shop or Facebook or other social networking sites to facilitate that talk and discussion with the audience. As I understand, NIHC is also providing education efforts and activities for IHE education and transmission. Especially, it's wonderful that we're having this online forum with experts and participants from all around the world. So the topic for session 3 is intangible cultural heritage in our daily lives towards a new age. For this session, we will be looking at ways of safeguarding ICH and as well as environmental sustainability and what is the role of the NGOs. And we will also be looking at the need for aligning ICH legal framework with the environmental laws, as well as the national policies for safeguarding of ICH, as well as the active roles to be played by communities and young people. So for the first presentation, we're going to invite Dr. Gregory Mitchell, the role of NGOs in safeguarding ICH and environmental sustainability. Dr. Mitchell is a researcher at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UCSD and also the founder of the Pacific Blue Foundation. Now, without further ado, let's hear from Dr. Gregory Mitchell.
Should I proceed? Yeah, am I supposed to proceed?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you so much to the World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage and the invitation to present the work that we've been doing as a NGO. Pacific Blue Foundation is the NGO with work in Fiji. And I have my co-authors indicated here in the title. And I have this quote from the first Prime Minister of Fiji after they gained independence from the United Kingdom. We carry the cultural and historical inheritance of ocean navigators of peerless skill and a courageous kin who crossed vast distances before the tribes of Europe had ventured forth from their small part of the earth. The part of the Pacific Ocean that these navigators covered was much larger than Europe itself. And you know, from a cultural evolution point of view, the origins of Oceania, migration of humans into Oceania, came out of South East Asia, and there was a culture called the Lapita culture that left its archaeological indications through pottery forms. And that culture seemed to skip the Solomon Islands to get all the way out into this part of the Pacific and into Fiji without following a nice smooth gradient that you can see in this upper left panel. You can't really read the diagram in the lower left very well, but these are the linguistic patterns that also support the fact that the hypothesis that these cultures that migrated into Oceania and the remote islands and eventually Polynesia and the greater Pacific Ocean were linked, but they came in episodic events, and this would have probably had to be supported by sailing vessels. And this was going on 3,000 years ago. And Fiji is shown in this figure in the upper right, and the main islands of Fiji, and I circle in red what I call Southeast Lao, and I expand that in the lower right to several islands in Southeast Lao that had a certain tree, a hardwood tree called Vesi, and that Vesi tree was ideal for building the canoes sailing canoes that they built to voyage on the open ocean. You can also see Tonga and Samoa in this upper right panel. And so Southeast Lao is actually as close to Tonga as it was to the main islands of Fiji, but also because the trade winds indicated by the blue arrows would allow them to navigate across the winds on their boats. So the Lauan people, the Southeast Lao, had strong kinship and cultural relationships with Samoa and Tonga and the sailing cultures. The navigator Tupaia from Polynesia joined the voyages of Captain Cook, and this in the upper left is a map of the islands that he had drawn in 1669 based on their knowledge using ancient Polynesian and Oceania navigational skills over millennia. And the lower left is just a chart of the Captain Cook's second voyage. But on the second voyage that came out of South Africa and through the Indian Ocean and over into the South Pacific, Captain Cook encountered the sailing canoes of Fiji. What I show here is a very large Drua, and you can see the size of it based on the scale of the humans. And these large handcrafted boats, the sailing canoes, were the connection, their interface that kept the people and the culture integrated. I'm sorry, it looks like that figure expands beyond the screen. The Fiji Islanders, this is a quote, the Fiji Islanders make their canoes principally from a hardwood called vehi, that's what Mariner Martin wrote. It's now called vesi, which is not liable to become worm-eaten, as the Tonga Islands do not produce this wood. All their large canoes, therefore, are either purchased or taken by force from the natives of Fiji. So Fiji had a fundamental role in the linking of this part of Oceania to the further eastward migration of humans. In 1953, Queen Elizabeth visited Fiji, and you can see in the Suvla Harbor, many of the small boats they call the Macau sailing around the ship, and there's a queen accepting a bouquet of flowers from a Fijian child. There's a wonderful article published by Bannock and Cox in the journal Economic Botany, and it's the details of the design of these sailing canoes, and also you can't really read the diagram on the right, but this is a list of all of the parts of the canoe and what they're made out of, what plant material, because there's no metal or plastic on these remote islands. Everything had to come from a plant. So the documentation of the canoe construction was provided by extensive interviews, still photography, video, and audio. And this boat that they built is in the Polynesian Cultural Center in Hawaii now, and you can visit it there. So, you know, the very nice talk that led us off by Mr. Mason talked about relationships, and that was very important. Before I could do the research and create the vision and have the projects, I had to develop relationships. And this gentleman I'm sitting with here, the man on the left is Samiti Dhama, also shown below. This is my first meeting with him in 2007. When I said, what would your vision be to keep the sailing canoes alive? He's a master carver. And the quest was to prevent extinction of 3,000 years of knowledge passed verbally from generation to generation. Very few elders still retain the knowledge. And the idea was, can we find these elders and can we encourage them to teach the young how to build these boats? And the vision they had was to create races, because that was a traditional part of their culture with these boats. So we created the Pacific Blue Foundation, this event called Veda Wanga. And Veda Wanga roughly means the boat lives. This is to keep the boat alive. In 2010, we had 4 canoes on the harbor in the races. By 2016, we had 8, and also 2 larger Drua had been built. So initiating the Veda Wanga in 2010 has resulted in revitalization of construction of the traditional sailing canoe. So to a certain extent, we've achieved that vision through this project of retaining it. Not only that, but there's an additional element that we started a few years later called Bakanawa, because that was also traditional, where the children would work with the elders and their parents and uncles and so forth and build small models, and they would sail the Bakanawa canoe. So the Bakanawa became part of passing this knowledge on to the youth. And here they are with a small Bakanawa getting ready for their race. and then all the participants, and you can see me back there with my Bula shirt in the back of the crowd there. But the Bacchanal is generating a lot of enthusiasm for the youth to then follow the footsteps or follow the sailing of their elders. As Satarayaki Domino is a master boat builder and sailor from Valanga Island, Fiji, and he has been building these boats near the capital of Suva, not on the remote island, but he loves the boats. He learned it from his grandfather, and here he is accepting prize money for winning the race, which he usually wins every year. But he also uses the boat for fishing. We've done several projects in constructing new boats. And I just want to go through some pictures of the process, getting to the forest, selecting a tree, bringing the tree down, hollowing the tree, working as a community, teaching the children how to work, the elders working with the youth. Very important process of passing on the knowledge. There's one of the holes carved out in the forest. But you can see the handiwork, beautiful work. This is a museum quality boat. And this one actually was on display in an exhibit at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art that opened last November with these colleagues of mine. But two of these Drua have recently been built by these craftsmen and the young men that are museum quality. In one case, they gave a gift to the Queen. There she is visiting the boat she was given. And the one below is in the Los Angeles County Museum. One younger man who is very enthusiastic about the boats is Jim Tuimote, Jim Fuluna. And he has a beautiful TEDx talk. If you get a chance, go to this link here that is shown at the bottom. But it's very inspiring about, although he grew up in the capital of Fiji in Suva, on the edge of Suva, that he has a very strong desire to build the boats, and the projects we've done have helped him engage that dream of his. You can see in the background of this presentation he gave at the TEDx call, the boats that were sailing during the Vela Longa project. Disney animated the film Moana based on the boats that we had revitalized in Fiji, and we're proud to have gotten special thanks from Fiji, from Disney for their Moana film. And the one lyric in there that I really like a lot is the one from We Know the Way. We tell the stories of our elders in a never-ending chain. And that's really what we set out to do, is to keep that alive. Now, revitalization, using these boats in a practical way for sustainable livelihoods can be a really valuable way to use the intangible culture and also to reduce greenhouse gases from fuel and ocean plastics. For example, our collaborator, Satarayaki, we call him Domo, he uses his boat to fish, and he says he catches as much fish from that as he would from a fiber boat with a motor. This larger Drua, you can see the two hulls, it's bigger than this other one. It's been built to take tourists for cultural tourist excursions. Both of these are sustainable livelihoods that are now being supported by the revitalization of building these sailing canoes in Fiji. The New York Times wrote an article in 2012. I had a quote, "Wind power, not petroleum, is an essential part for the survival of culture and the biodiversity of these regions. If they continue to just draw down their resources to pay for their petrol, it will be the end of the traditional lifestyle." With using petroleum and motors in a globalized economy, they have to get real world currency, catching way more fish to pay for the petroleum. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present this very interesting intangible cultural heritage and art that's been kept alive for more than 3,000 years in Fiji. And I'll be looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
네, 미첼 박사님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitchell.
And from his presentation, we were able to understand the islanders of Fiji, especially in relation to the traditional canoe making, which was a very valuable asset for them. And they were using the inherent tree materials from that region, which provided a very important connection between the past as well as the present. And especially if we look at the current world economy as well as the forces of globalization, there's a declining population of those people that are making the traditional sailing canoes. So providing support for these canoe making technologies and also conducting various different activities, we would be able to seek an opportunity to ensure sustainability in terms of ICH. And I believe that the role that was played by Pacific Blue Foundation was very critical. In order for ICH to become a living heritage, the communities that are involved must be fully engaged because and their participation would have to be looked at from a macro point of view, and they also provide historic specificity. And as a result, UNESCO, in terms of safeguarding ICH, very much emphasizes the role that should be played by NGOs. Now we will move on to the second presentation.
Our second presentation will be given by Dr. Anita Vaivade on nature, intangible cultural heritage, and the law. Dr. Vaivade has been a professor at the Latvian Academy of Culture since 2012, and from 2013 and 2015, she has headed the Latvian delegation to the Intergovernmental Committee for ICH Convention. And beginning in 2017, she has been leading the Policy and Laws Chair Program on ICH at the Latvia Cultural Academy. I currently understand that she is working as a facilitator for the ICH Convention. So now we'd like to hear from you, Ms. Anita.
Hello, thank you indeed for these introductory words. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation to participate and contribute to the forum, as well as for their kind cooperation throughout the preparation of this forum. So now it really provides us a platform for discussing issues of our common concern, both globally and locally. Before tackling the question, why does law matter for our discussion and in what ways, I would like to start with some thoughts on nature and intangible cultural heritage. Nature and intangible cultural heritage are widely used as two distinct concepts, and as such, they are used in various discourses. Some may, however, see nature and intangible cultural heritage as being one. In other words, one may see both among humans and with other parts of nature. Nevertheless, I will pursue the distinct use of these concepts, as it is also the way legal discourse has been dominantly shaped internationally, as well as domestically at a global scale. Nature and intangible cultural heritage are profoundly and closely intertwined. Humans sustain their livelihoods through the use of natural resources and through a continuous advancement of knowledge in this respect. Natural raw materials are used for expressing human creativity in diverging forms, for instance, through crafts that have both functional and aesthetic values, including textile, as we can see in the picture. Human-shaped landscapes create soundscapes. They dwell in nature, learn from nature, and get inspiration from nature for their thinking and being in the world. And thus, they also build their identities upon nature. Humans also express their knowledge and beliefs about nature in diverse languages, developing conceptions and vocabularies that may further be transmitted through stories, poems, and songs. As one may read, for example, in a Latvian folk song, one among numerous such concise folklore texts revealing human being and living in nature, what could be wrong in living beside the edge of a vast, mighty wood? 5 stacks had I to plough my land, and 6 young deer to harrow it. Connections between humans and nature are expressed in so many diverse, creative, and colorful ways. Through such examples, we learn about both cultural and biological diversity worldwide. And these connections are also expressed in law in various ways and for various reasons. So let us first take a look at the way the connection between biological and cultural diversity has been expressed in international law. Over the last couple of decades, we have come to being aware globally and recognizing in international law not only the importance of protecting biological and cultural diversity, but also of their reciprocal connectivity. There are various international treaties that we might consider as source of international law relevant to either nature protection or intangible cultural heritage safeguarding, but let me mention at this moment only two of them. The Convention on Biological Diversity, adopted in 1992, witnessed a global concern that biological diversity is being significantly reduced by certain human activities. In this convention, the cultural importance of biological diversity was also recognized, as well as the close and traditional dependence of many indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles on biological resources. Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity followed in 2001. While adopted primarily with concerns for safeguarding world's cultural diversity, it recognized the contribution of traditional knowledge also with regard to environmental protection and the management of natural resources, and fostering synergies between modern science and local knowledge. Both of these documents recognize the importance of traditional lifestyles and traditional knowledge, with a particular concern about indigenous and local communities. However, this may be seen also beyond, speaking more broadly of diverse parts of society worldwide. International law gives us profoundly valuable reference for common understanding, as well as common standards and objectives, be it in the field of nature protection or cultural heritage safeguarding. At present, we see how global ecological changes reach us at local and domestic level and influence our daily lives. In a similar manner, the understandings agreed upon at international level need to find their expression in domestic law in the context of diverging legal histories, traditions, systems, terminologies, and sources. Metaphorically speaking, national laws may have comparable patterns, as in the picture we see. However, they are necessarily weaved with different threads and on different looms. These legal differences and commonalities we may observe worldwide is also a tremendously interesting part of our cultural diversity. It is with this idea of the importance of domestic level and the potential richness of approaches we may find that with a team of French and Latvian researchers and in close collaboration with scholars in altogether 26 countries worldwide, we undertook 6 years ago a research project named Osmosis on the national laws related to intangible cultural heritage safeguarding. And I would like to acknowledge and thank all colleagues for this common journey of research, as well as all partners who have supported this undertaking. Our interest was, among other, to see how within the national legal patterns, these threads of intangible cultural heritage are intertwined with other fields of law. And environmental law was one of such fields of junction. The results of this study have just been published earlier this September in a collective monograph. In there, our colleague Professor Jérôme Fromageau explores the interactions between intangible cultural heritage and environmental law. As he analyzes, we may observe such interactions at national level, in particular regarding the management of natural resources, such as forest ecosystems and wetlands and water systems. In some cases, these management practices rely on the respect of local customary law. For example, in the case of traditional water tribunals, we may find such examples in different regions of the world, including, for instance, in Spain, irrigators tribunals of the Spanish Mediterranean coast, the Council of Wise Men of the plain of Murcia, and the Water Tribunal of the plain of Valencia. Or also in Peru, namely the traditional system of Corongos water judges. Both of these examples are recognized as intangible cultural heritage at the international level. Overall, we have observed in this research project that issues relating to the respect of traditional knowledge and practices are more and more taken under consideration when dealing with the management of natural resources. Because of their long history, traditional practices have largely proven their capacity to preserve certain forms of biodiversity. In other words, in most cases, sustainability is profoundly characteristic to traditional practices of local communities, reassuring their livelihoods through a sustainable use of local natural resources. And this needs to have its legal recognition. As Professor Fromageau has pointed out, I quote, "Even if it is true that certain traditional practices conflict with legislations pertaining to the protection of biodiversity, many of these laws address this tension by including some exceptions to accommodate these practices," end of quote. Thus, we may observe ways for finding balance between the environmental concerns and sensitivity towards traditional practices regarding the use of nature resources, including through setting exceptions in national laws. Let me illustrate this by some examples, which will be regionally closer to my own personal experiences. I have recently undertaken a research with interest in the way intangible cultural heritage is or could be used as a resource for sustainable development in Northern Europe, and how could rights-based approaches serve for that purpose. Therefore, I would like to propose some insights from this region. In the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, we see examples where certain traditional practices of local communities related to the use of natural resources, such as harvesting wild berries, are respected in the case of protected areas, such as national parks or regional parks. Further north, in the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, so-called everyone's rights to enjoy nature, including forests, are protected, ensuring public access to nature, also on private lands. It means the rights to walk and cross the land, temporarily stay on it, and pick flowers, berries, or mushrooms. Meanwhile, in all of these examples, there is the obligation to remain considerate and respectful towards natural environment. Such examples allowing to legally maintain traditional practices do not mean that no difficulties would be faced in advocating for such a quest for balance. Often, advocacy is needed and is carried out regarding both domestic and international regulations. For example, Estonia, a country of numerous small islands in the Baltic Sea, with the long traditions of communities to use local natural resources, has advocated internationally for a sustainable scale for seal hunt and trade in seal products, acknowledging that the small-scale seal hunting and full utilization of the hunted seals is an old tradition of local communities. As we may read in its governmental report regarding regulations at the European Union level, I quote, "This question is important not only for resource-efficient behavior, but for the local communities of Estonia's small islands to keep alive their cultural heritage and traditions. Aforementioned communities are very interested in small-scale marketing, sell them as handicraft, of the products made from hunted seals, in order to compensate the expenses spent on the hunt, and also to introduce the traditions of creation and use of these products. The lack of the legal ability to sell even a minor amount of seal products affects the tourism development of local communities and the preservation of traditions in certain areas," end of quote. Thus, we do see various layers of sustainability being involved, both environmental and cultural, as well as economic and social, which witnesses once again the importance of an integrated approach and a quest for balance. In conclusion, let me propose some prospective observations. A harmonious coexistence of intangible cultural heritage safeguarding and environmental protection seems to remain conditioned by the scale of use of natural resources. As far as such use concerns local communities and their livelihoods, traditional practices are, in most cases, profoundly sustainable and would merit their recognition in legal terms. The rights and interests of indigenous and local communities regarding their sustainable traditional practices of the management of natural resources need to be continuously addressed in further legal developments. And I believe there is a potential in putting the international intangible cultural heritage law in use for this purpose. I also believe the global attention to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and their integration in various national policies and monitoring mechanisms will enhance the awareness raising at national level worldwide on the junction points between intangible heritage and environmental protection. However, there is still advocacy needed to raise awareness and to influence legislative processes at various levels, addressing the points of junction between environmental and cultural sustainability of nature-related knowledge and practices. In the end, these two fields of law, intangible cultural heritage safeguarding and environmental protection, have the same overarching goal to ensure the sustainability of living and being in the world, and to do so with respect towards both biological and cultural diversity. So with these final words, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the upcoming discussion. Thank you.
네, 아니타 교수님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Anita. Through your presentation, I think that we were able to once again rethink the relationship between ICH protection and nature, especially when it comes to protecting intangible cultural heritage and nature. There is definitely a role that laws can play, and that you've also pointed out the relationship between international law and national law.
So we will move on to the third speaker of the day, Dr. Eric Zeruto. His presentation is titled The Role of the State in Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage in the COVID-19 Era. Professor Zeruto is the director of CCCPET at Santo Tomas University, Philippines, and the professor of the Graduate School for Cultural Heritage. Currently working at NCCA Cultural Education Program as a cultural heritage consultant. And he's also serving as the Filipino executive member of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention and the Philippines delegate for 2003 UNESCO Convention. With that, I would like to introduce to you Professor Eric Zeruto.
Thank you very much. I'd like to greet everybody, all our onliners. Pleasant day. I would like to thank the organizers of this 2020 World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage. And also I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of my colleagues, Ms. Beverly Bautista and Father Jonas, in the preparation of this presentation. From the Philippines, I'd like to share with you this presentation entitled Pulso, the Philippine Intangible Cultural Heritage in Times of COVID-19 Pandemic. Resonating COP21, nature can exist without man, but man cannot exist without nature. Natural heritage is the source of cultural heritage, that all meanings and narratives that relate the two dimensions are human construct called intangible cultural heritage. Recalling the excerpt from the 2003 Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, whereby intangible cultural heritage is the community's response to their environment, their interaction with nature, and their history. ICH is about the people's values, particularly people's harmonious relations with nature. It is the source of psychosocial stability for the community to survive supernatural ruptures. In the Philippines, when our body is not in balance, healers, doctors take our pulse, or we call this pulso. Community living traditions dictated the resurgence of indigenous healthcare practices to spare local peoples from the pandemic, even under the directives of our Philippine government. This ICH narrative was evident during the cholera pandemic in 1820s, the Spanish flu pandemic in the 1920s, resonating until now in this COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. In the 1820s, the cholera pandemic swept the Philippines during the Spanish period, which was the scourge that evolved legislations based on health and sanitation. Gleaned from the correspondence of Pasiano Rizal, the brother of our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, this was narrated by our historian Ambet Ocampo, to where cholera's situation plagued the Philippines in the 19th century. Once cholera spread from the busy port of Manila to nearby provinces, the house where the carrier stayed was immediately burned. In the beginning, the officials were hiding the incident so that they would not declare the port dirty and consequently disrupt the bullish export trade. The rapid spread moved the governor to order blankets and medicines from Hong Kong to be distributed to the provinces. He inspected the public markets in Manila to check on spoiled fruits, meat, and fish needed to be thrown away. Food that would cause a disease, such as dried fish and shrimp paste, were all forbidden. The people went to early morning masses, Catholic masses that went on in processions every night. Novenas, prayers for Saint Roch, patron saint of the sick, were recited incessantly, and priests were everywhere to bring spiritual aid. The officials scrambled afterwards to fix quarantine procedures in Philippine ports. Spanish legislations were required to ensure health and sanitation. Specifically, the Cartilla Higienica y Desinfectación con las precauciones que deben tomarse en el caso de una invasión colérica. This was issued by the Provincial Commission and Council of Sanitation in Madrid in 1884, specifically for the Philippine colony. The historian Francis Gialogo extensively studied the 1920 Spanish flu pandemic in the Philippines. His introductory discussion highlighted the American colonial officials' lack of seriousness that led to misinformation on public health and miscalculation of our public health statistics. The source of the disease was attributed to the longshoremen and other laborers along the waterfronts of the Manila port. This indicated the foreign origin of the disease from other parts of the world. So, according to the statistics, the Spanish influenza pegged 70,000 to 90,000 deaths, with 6.8 to 9.2 deaths per thousands of population. Marine and land quarantine were imposed. There were many activities that were conducted during the lockdowns, such as prevention of communicable disease lectures, distribution of medicine and anti-influenza bulletins, sanitary orders for cleaning, even the construction of this type of sanitation system, the Antipolo style, in the middle of the booming Manila cityscape. There were even sanitary provisions to clean up candy bars and ice cream shops, even the poisoning of stray dogs. Folk practices and herbal medicine emerged, and even the cooking of a very popular rice porridge with ginger and chicken was recommended. Behind these measures, problems were encountered in combating the epidemic. Problems retaining the health personnel due to resignation. There was the blame game that ensued on the ranks of the colonial officials. There was no contingent plan to highlight many of this congestion in the leper colonies, even in the prisons. In the end, this Manual for Management of Communicable Disease was published in 1919, which provided basic information and protocols on influenza. Totally caught unaware in the first quarter of 2020, the whole world panicked with fear and uncertainty with the new coronavirus that emerged from Wuhan, China. To survive, people just called for a healthy ecosystem, holistic well-being, and food security. On March 15, our President Rodrigo Duterte, declared a 2-month lockdown on the whole Philippines. The government provided guidelines for local government officials to follow under the supervision of the Department of Health. He also signed into law the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, Republic Act 11469, which granted him special powers to address the outbreak in the whole country. The National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the highest cultural policy making of the country, supported the program to extend financial help to displaced cultural workers. The assistance program for cultural workers under the state calamity provided a cash assistance of $1.54 million dedicated to almost 15,000 freelance artists. To grasp the magnitude of the COVID-19 impact to the cultural sector, the Commission launched the online survey on the impact of COVID-19 on culture and the arts, and through its Philippine Cultural Education Program, initiated Dunong Katutubo program regarding the documentation of local community indigenous practices on cultural resilience and survival. While the whole country was under lockdown, the Catholic Church was immobilized and was isolated. But nonetheless, the churches developed practices to communicate the devotion of powerful images to the people. Dungao, this is a tradition wherein the appearance of religious images were shown through windows, doors, even rooftops, which provided spiritual comfort to the community. Let me walk you through 3 indigenous peoples' practices that were observed, that emerged during the height of the national lockdown. This is Te'er and Tingao, the significance of compulsory rest day of the Bontocs in the Mountain Province. The Mountain Province is in the region of the famous Ifugao Rice Terraces, our World Heritage Site. It is one of the provinces composing the Cordillera region, which includes Benguet, Ifugao, Kalinga, Apayao, and Abra. Cordillera traditional leaders put very high priority to public welfare, emphasizing social contact and decisions and actions in local governance. According to Governor Bonifacio Lacwasan, as indigenous peoples, we listen to the bearers of indigenous wisdom. It has kept our people safe and strong since time immemorial. On the March 30th, with a rampage for food relief, Mayor Gabion Gangangan of Sadanga declared in his FB account that his local government would not get any relief food pack from the national agency. Instead, he requested that this be given to more needy areas in the country. Compulsory village confinement is invoked in the whole province of the mountains. It could be called Te'er, Tengao, Sede, Pare, Kabaya, or Tungao. In nearby Ifugao province, it's called Tungo or Tungao, while in the Kalinga province, it's called Ngilin. Te'er has many contexts. It happens before and after a chuno. Chuno is an elaborate feast of merit among the elite in the Bontoc Mountain province. Te'er gives farmers also time to decide on work allocations around household members to avail of resources and enforce physical rest from heavy labor. Te'er is also resorted to during critical environment constraints, particularly spread of sickness and pestilence. It also serves as a means to gather the focused attention of the community on critical issues that affect the general welfare. With the Luzon lockdown at the height of COVID-19 pandemic, the Mountain Province resorted to their living tradition in the institution of the Te'er and Tingao. In one area in the Mountain Province, Te'er is conducted with the offering of a chicken with salted meat called changte. After the ritual, elders put plant cuttings or tikken. These are guava-like cuttings. Some put carabao skulls in front of their houses, or they just bundle grass tied loosely. This signifies no entry or no movement in and around the village. In Sagada town, the elders performed March 21 the Sede. In the capital of Bontoc, the very revered elder Changar Fakat performed the Manangte, which involved divining omens from the internal organs of the chicken. Fires were kept burning all throughout for several days as a protective charm against the virus. The next ritual is also from a nearby region. This is called Ananud, Panud, Abang, and Gakit. This is the river ritual of the Cagayan Valley indigenous community. The Cagayan Valley region is the domicile of the Itawit, Ibanag, Yogad, Gadang indigenous peoples. The region is composed of provinces of Nueva Vizcaya, Isabela, Cagayan, traversed by the El Rio Grande de Cagayan. The 4 indigenous communities share similar heritage related to Anud, or in English, swept by the river. As narrated, the tradition was performed last August 16 in Amulung, where the main idea was to make a floating vessel full of offerings to be swept along the river to stem the COVID-19. There were various intents to ward off pestilence, sickness, or bad luck they call angul, to prepare for a festival to prevent a sequence of negative events, to appease the deities of the river so as not to get the children while they are playing in these rivers. Preparation involved local town officials who sponsored the construction of the bamboo boat and even private ones for the decoration. Carpenters had to clean up themselves to do the 14, 13, 12-layered combination of young bamboo rafts. Then the construction of motif made of nature-inspired embellishments. You know, inside this raft, offerings were laid ceremoniously. There was sticky rice, chick, areca nut, tobacco, wine. On extreme cases, a pig's head with red band and earrings were required. From the house of the head, the surcano, 4 young men with spiritual commitment carry the boat on their shoulders. They all go to a procession where people put inserted clothing of the sick children, insert clothing from themselves, or drop coins on the boat. Along the riverbank, a ceremony of dancing, singing, and music ensued while the boat laid on ground. So, after which the boat flowed along the current, while the Surcano called the deities in a dalugay. He summoned the deities to accept all the gift offerings, keep the community from sickness, and spare the children from death. The last practice is we call Panubad Tupad. This is a chicken ritual of the Ata tribe of Davao City. Davao Island has the highest concentration of indigenous communities in the whole country. It is a city that's shared by 11 tribes. For indigenous peoples, it's called the Obo Manuvu, Patigsalog, Bago Klata, Bagobo, Tagabawa, and the Ata tribes. Muslim communities included Iranut, Maguindanaon, Tausug, Sama, Maranao, and Kagan. So the city government developed this Kadayawan village, an eco-museum for all these indigenous communities to converge. This is where they practice their community traditions and customs. After the strict lockdown of the whole country, the Ata tribe requested to conduct Panubat Tupad, a ceremony to ward off this sickness. Led by the tribal leader, Dato Lumayong Bayuntong, he began with a white chicken, which signified a form of thanksgiving and also to give them guidance and ways in their activities for the future. He had to kill the chicken, he had the blood drip in the 4 corners of the house, and he looked out for all the signals, particularly when the chicken collapsed. Where the head pointed to the east, this was auspicious events over the future, while to the west, prudence had to be taken for the imminent problems. When the head pointed to the north-south, each member of the community had to be responsible for most of their actions. ICH is a meaning-making activity of man to make sense of nature, environment, society, and history. ICHs are interaction based on the heartbeat of nature and the universe. According to our Filipino anthropologist, F. Landa Hocano, life is conceived by people in harmony with nature. The pulse is its expression. Anything which tends to interfere with this flow of harmony upsets the pulse beat. Imbalance of nature is the plague of man. So man must feel this pulse of the earth. With that, thank you very much. And I greet everyone a pleasant afternoon.
예, 에릭 제르도 교수님 감사합니다. 그
Thank you
교수님
very much, Dr. Zerudo. So that was actually a 100-year interval from the 1820 to 9020 and 2000. There were pandemics that occurred in the Philippines, and you talked about how the country was able to respond to these crises and how the indigenous people were able to respond very effectively and wisely using the ICH to the pandemic, including COVID-19. And you share with us a very interesting examples. Thank you.
So now we'll move on to our third presentation. This is a presentation about some members of the ICH Youth Network on joining our voices in intangible cultural heritage.
Thank you very much. It's truly our great honor to be here today and to be able to share with you in our perspective as youth. As been said, we are students from Korean National University of Cultural Heritage, majoring in Intangible Heritage and Heritage Management. In this presentation, we'd like to talk at the cases that we and young people worldwide working in the field of ICH have strived to make a force to safeguard and promote it. So I'll be taking you through the overview first, and Sebin will be presenting the first case of ICH safeguarding activities from us, and Siwon will be followed on the second case from various countries. Lastly, Do-hee will be taking the conclusion. So please note that we will be using different cases to describe the various youth activities. As already recognized, all of us are preparing for the post-corona era. Current infectious diseases are not irrelevant to the disturbance of nature ecosystems, which is caused by climate change and environmental destruction. Changes in the nature environment have a significant influence on the function of the ecosystem and the livelihood of humankind. It is true that human activities today gradually become more diverse worldwide, and they show a form of indiscriminate consumption of resources. However, over time, the accumulated knowledge and practices have also been used to minimize climate change and sustainable use of nature resources. Ultimately, traditional knowledge, values, and practices as part of ICH have guided human societies in their interactions with the surrounding nature environment for millennia. Please take a look on the photos. I'll take the example of Korean Jeju Haenyeo, which literally means women divers and engages in nature-friendly fishing. They've shared their knowledge of the sea and marine life based on the accumulated experience. And the culture of Jeju Haenyeo has promoted environmental sustainability with community involvement in management of fishing practices. In this regard, we are expecting that the knowledge and practices of ICH related to environment has the capacity to evolve and adapt for a more sustainable use of nature resources when necessary. As such, living heritage has been changed according to generations who have coexisted with nature. And we ask questions about our role as those living in this era and working in the field of cultural heritage. It is often said that young people are the successors of heritage and future generation who would create new traditions. Currently, young people studying and transmitting ICH around us have rarely experienced it in their daily lives, relatively compared with different generations. We've learned this attribute of ICH and have struggled to handle this in our respective places, at the same time dreaming to naturally coexist with ICH in our daily lives. However, there is a lack of room for communication for young people who seek better ideas and share their concerns in the field of ICH. Young people worldwide are passing their messages through ICH-related activities. So from the next slide, we'll speak to you about examples of our efforts to safeguard and promote ICH.
The first case is ICH documentation practice. ICH documentation practice is a lecture offered at the KNUCH. It combines essential theoretical learning and field practice. By using various types of documentation, students can find out the purpose and significance of documentation. Based on this, the goal is for students to practice the basics of the documentation in order to lay the foundation for field experience and practice. For on-the-job training, we visit the Festival of Korean Intangible Cultural Heritage and create the presentation and record individual events selected in advance before the tour. By using preferred method, the results of the work are shared. Consequently, we could improve the understanding of each event and monitoring projects. The second case is UNESCO World Heritage Youth Avengers. The UNESCO World Heritage Youth Avengers is a group association for youth selected for a 4-person team with 100 domestic and foreign university students. These activities focus on the study of world heritage and world archives, including ICH. And this organization for youth largely carries out policy planning, education, and promotion and field activities. Regarding policy planning, planned project and related policy, networks, and campaigns are executed. For education and public relations, online and offline activities are conducted. In 2011, this project was launched to spread the culture that protects the UNESCO heritage of Korea. Among participants, there was an academic exchange that helped convey the value of cultural heritage to the public through various activities. The last case is Youth Activist. This is the youth project hosted by Daejeon Culture and Art Foundation. Daejeon ICH 단청장 이정우 was the main theme in 2019. We recorded part of his life story that were unedited, as well as information that was not conveyed in photographs, text, or painting. The information was published as an independent publication. Prior to the documentation of the ICH, a workshop consisting of 8 students was held. Using storytelling skills, we visited Lee Jung-woo's workroom and made field records through each perspective and share with others. These projects are conducted for youth regardless of their majors. While engaging in youth activities related to the ICH, we felt the necessary for excellence and continuous protections and felt the responsibility for constant promotion. Through the activity, it was possible to carry out activities directly related to ICH and give us an opportunity to rethink the commonplace attitude toward cultural heritage. It could be said that the KNUCH, as a university with a particular purpose in the field of cultural heritage, has much practice-related information to share. However, most of the practical fields that protect and revitalize ICH are left to individuals. Even for students majoring in ICH, it was not easy to be exposed to related activities other than the regular curriculum at school. There is also a significant lack of opportunity and experience where young people can actively participate and speak out or grow as volunteers. Therefore, it is necessary to create a place where youth, performers, and field researchers can share their thought and continuously exchange on ICH.
I'm going to introduce stories of youth at home and abroad. There are a lot of young people who are interested in ICH all over the world, despite a variety of political, economic, and social conditions. Young people are attempting to carry out various activities for safeguarding, preserving, and promoting ICH with consideration of the environment. First of all, Koemche is a design company led by Soyoung Park, a youth representative. These pictures refer to the culture of Jeju Haenyeo. However, there's just little public interest in spite of its cultural value. In addition, over 1,000 pieces of Haenyeo's clothes are discarded every year in Jeju. She draws attention to the alienated Haenyeo culture and environmental issues. Then she makes upcycling textile products. Upcycling is a process that transforms a discarded object into a completely different form by adding a design, and it creates a new value. This can be seen as being in contact with the spirit of ICH that insisted on creative transmission and utilization. She produces not only a variety of modern products such as pouches and bottles, but also unique accessories that focused on goods actually used by Haenyeo, such as momji, which looks like a keyring on this slide. In Belarus, there's a youth NGO, Student Ethnographic Association, which engages in systematic and practical activities to safeguard and revitalize ICH. Members of the group conduct educational activities for youth every year in the form of non-formal education and public relations activities. This year, it was canceled due to the COVID-19, but you can find that they planned and operated a well-organized summer camp last year in conjunction with neighboring countries. Moreover, they record and document local ICH, participate in the development of educational programs in cooperation with institutions, and introduce and promote ICH through SNS. It is of great significance that it has strengthened its position as a group through ongoing activities and expanded the base of youth participation in ICH. While some countries have active youth organizations, some countries are making national efforts to revitalize youth communities like Eritrea in Africa. The UNESCO projects from 2014 to 2018 in Eritrea especially focuses on the youth community to raise awareness among young people on ICH. The project's final report includes efforts, interviews on the role of youth in safeguarding ICH, and workshops to promote interest in specific activities using the media outlets. As general recommendations, it induces creation of UNESCO culture clubs and suggests that the number of youth activities should be further increased. Young people who are interested in ICH and actively engage in programs as individuals or organizations, even though they major in or not, are scattered around the world. Besides, there are still many places where youth communities want to be formed to increase participation in the transmission of future generation or raise awareness of ICH itself. Therefore, for a better global community, young people should share good activities and projects in practice with each other and establish a support and cooperation system for struggling communities.
As a conclusion, I would like to talk about the necessity of forming a youth network. Through the examples mentioned earlier, young people who are currently active in the ICH field experience a limitation in exchanging information and communication and lack opportunities to grow as a voluntary entity. Therefore, there is an increased necessity for a network where the young generation can share their concerns, form a consensus, and not give up their efforts to preserve and transmit ICH. Youth networks are expected to play the following roles in supporting the youth. Firstly, creating places where youth can communicate with each other is not only a prerequisite for interaction, but it also bears the symbolic meaning that can remind the people of each other's presence. Experiencing and exchanging information is a must of forming a spontaneous and dynamic system of the young generation's ICH-related activities. As a result, young people can also strengthen their abilities, and the youth culture of the ICH field will inevitably evolve through this. Secondly, current support for youth in the culture field are meaningful in providing space for them to try something out. However, in many cases, support projects are generally one-off. And if an organization or institution stops supporting, the youth's activities inevitably discontinue as well. Therefore, it is necessary to secure a stable structure for sustaining independent activities based on youth's initiatives to establish a system. Furthermore, we are witnessing the increase in young people who don't experience ICH in their daily lives due to changes in social structure and find ICH not connected to their own life anymore. The youth, however, has a critical role as the future generation to transmit and enjoy the ICH. Therefore, we need a place where young people from various fields can gather and get exposed to freely talk about ICH. This will facilitate a better understanding and communication about ICH. The problem of environmental destruction and pollution are not significantly influencing humanity. This is why there is a growing need for us and future generations to look for ways to achieve sustainable development together. Within this environment, young people who will be the leading players of the future generations are dreaming of safeguarding and revitalizing the eternal shared value of the ICH. To this end, on the Intangible Heritage Youth Network, we hope that considerations of forming a healthy youth culture ecosystem and further implementing sustainable development for the youth and environment will be taken into account. Thank you.
네, 우리
Thank you very much. We've just heard from some students attending the Korea National University of Cultural Heritage. Thank you for the presentation. We'll now move on to our panel discussion session.
자, 패널 토의는
For the panel discussion, we've just heard from our 4 presenters, so 3 individual presenters and 1 group of presenters. So there are also common questions to be asked of our speakers, and there will be individual questions as well. And we have online participants who will be sending in their questions and comments as well. But we're going to give you some time to prepare your answers. So I think I'll just give you a list of the questions so that each of the speakers will have the time to think about the responses. First, to Dr. Gregory Mitchell. Around the world, I think the most challenging element is, especially due to COVID-19, a lot of industries, especially the culture and art and also ICH, have been greatly affected by the COVID-19 and pandemic, and especially the tourism sector, because there has been a limited activities in terms of incoming and outgoing traffic. I'm sure they were very much in difficult situations. And according to the WTO, World Tourism Organization, in March 2020, about 60 to 80% of the international travelers incoming into the region will be reduced. But the income source of tourism, it's very much concentrated in the Pacific small island nations because they're the travel destination for many travelers. I'm sure they're the hardest hit among other countries. So what are some of the difficulties that these communities are undergoing, especially in the Pacific region since the COVID-19 broke out? What are some of the efforts that these communities are making in order to overcome these difficulties?
For Professor Anita, I think that there were some questions from our online audiences, but I also have prepared a question. So you've told us about how there are cultural heritage elements found in environmental law and some other domestic laws as well, that it's important for us to strike a balance between these different laws, especially for the sake of sustainability. So your conclusion was really inspirational for me because we're ultimately trying to achieve sustainability. Can you give us some more specific examples of how environmental protection comes together with ICH?
My question goes to Dr. Zarud. Dr. Zarudo talk about different regions and how ICH were utilized in terms of responding to the COVID-19 crisis by people there. So especially in the crisis situation, in order to preserve ICH, does the national government have a policy to safeguard ICH, especially in the face of the COVID-19 crisis?
Next, I would like to ask our team, the ICH Youth Network team. I do have a question for you as well. And this is something that you already mentioned in your presentation, but there's the older generations or ancient generation and the future generation. They come together through the connection of the youth. So the youth is really the mediator between the older generation and the future generation. However, it's very difficult to find youth who are interested in actual transmission. Of course, as you mentioned, the role of the youth is very important. What is the most important element to consider to have more youth transmit and learn the different crafts and ICH elements? And I would also like to ask a question for all of our speakers. I did mention this early in my opening remarks, but because of COVID-19, we're often talking about this new normal, how we're going to be facing a completely new world after the pandemic. Now, if the new normal is here, I actually think we're already living in the new normal now. But if we are living in the new normal in the future, what is going to happen to ICH? How will ICH be practiced? How will it be safeguarded and transmitted? So these are the questions that I'm giving out to you. We'll hear your responses and then go through another round of questions. I would like to ask our first presenter, Dr. Mitchell, to respond first.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Do you want me to ask a question?
예, 질문을 드렸는데요. 제가
Yes,
다시
we just asked your question. So should I repeat the question for you? Did you hear the question? Did you get the question, Dr. Mitchell?
I'm sorry, I'm not getting the translation.
그러면 그 혹시
Okay, I've got the English on now. Sorry. So I'm sorry, I've got the English on now. Is there a question?
네, 질문은 예. 그러면
Okay, so I'm just going to make that question very brief. So in 2020, the COVID-19 has had significant impact on various projects and programs, and especially in the tourism travel sector. It has been the hardest hit of all the industries, I believe. And in particular, like those islands such as Fiji, those small island countries probably suffer the most. So the communities in the Pacific, what are the difficulties that they're undergoing as a result of COVID-19, and what are the efforts that they're making in order to overcome these difficulties?
Yeah, the tourist industry in Fiji has been hurt substantially. I think they've kept the outbreaks under control now. I'm in California now, I'm not in Fiji, but I think that the effects have not been too bad in terms of local community spread. However, because of the lack of travel into Fiji by the tourists, the industry has really been shut down. So many of the resorts are closed or operating at very low capacity. They are supporting some tourism from Fijian people taking weekend vacation or short. But the international tourist industry has really been cut back. And I'm not living there in Fiji, so I don't know the day in and day out challenges that everybody's having. I do talk with some of the staff and some of the people there on a regular basis, but it's really has caused problems like it has throughout the world. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 저희
Yes, thank you
우리나라
very much. I think we are facing a similar situation here at the Republic of Korea as well. So now, can we hear from Dr. Anita? Can you respond to your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question asked. I think in my response, I will make a connection also to what was mentioned during the keynote speech today, and mainly the importance of the access to natural spaces, also mentioning hiking as tradition. And in this regard, I just would like to also say that, for instance, hunting and fishing is one of the aspects which are regulated by different laws, both internationally as well as nationally. And we do find certain, for instance, exceptions which are specifically adopted in order to encourage, let's say, young people to pursue certain fishing practices. And there are that kind of junctions also in the Nordic countries. I was mentioning every man's rights in the case of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. It doesn't necessarily imply fishing and hunting, but there are some exceptions in this regard. There are also discussions ongoing regarding specific hunting and fishing practices and whether they are respectful towards animals or not. And these discussions are really to be addressed primarily at the national level. You were also asking about the new normal, the question, how would we pursue further with ICH practices after these current global circumstances we're all facing? And in that regard, I just would like to mention that we had inspiring examples in Latvia, how singing tradition, dancing tradition, how they were really made an online practices, and the way how people are able to cooperate also through all online formats. We really discovered that now at this present conditions we're all facing. Thank you.
네, 고맙습니다.
So thank you for the response. Next, Dr. Zerudo, could I have your response, please?
Yes, thank you very much for that question regarding the role of our national government in the midst of the COVID-19. Well, to be very honest, all of us, I think, were caught flat-footed. Everybody was caught unaware of the upsurge of this pandemic, and our national government was really the national government faced the wall on what were the protocols that had to be undertaken. So they really had to turn over a lot of these procedures and guidelines to the local government. But on the national level, I mentioned earlier that the immediate response was to ensure that our artists, our craftsmen, had to survive. So there was a monetary facility that were sent out. We're an archipelago, so we had to make sure that this amount of money had to reach the individuals that were listed in our national registry in the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. But there were some innovative programs, such as the Cultural Center of the Philippines, the Performing Arts Center of the whole country, released certain grants to certain artistic groups for them to practice their crafts as well. And many of these innovative programs, they were able to upload online, and were still able to perform many of these traditional dances, many of these traditional dramas and theaters. Quite interestingly, though, most of the practices that emerged were really practices that had very, very few government, how do we say, promptings. No, they just emerged. The three cases that I narrated to you were actually practices that had always been there. It came out just naturally because these indigenous peoples were used to those particular situations that had very difficult calamities, very difficult ruptures in life. We found out that the most effective way really to ensure the continuity of many of these practices and the idea of gathering, although virtual, had been through a network. So recently we were able to put together the ICH Philippines network. This is a network of communities, of groups, of individuals, all the way from the north in Batanes to the southernmost island in Sulu, to gather on an online regular meeting to share their practices and how they survive in the everyday during this pandemic. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 자,
Thank you very much for your response. So now may I like to turn to the questions from the Korean National University of Cultural Heritage. Yes, thank you very much for the question. So the youth should be able to take some more initiative, and it's very important for us to do that. And you asked us what are the important elements to consider to make that happen. And I think that it's really important to maintain and foster a sort of connection. Intangible cultural heritage is something that changes over time. It continues to evolve. So I think it really has to do with the sensibilities and feelings and emotions of our people. So for example, there's intangible cultural heritage of kimchi making, where the family all gathers together to make kimchi together. Or maybe the different mother of pearl cabinets that my grandmother passes on to me when I get married. So there is that sort of emotional element, but I think, as I mentioned before in the presentation, there's this gap between the youth and ICH because they don't have first-hand experience using ICH in their everyday lives. And so it's just very difficult to try to establish a connection with ICH. And I know that I'm being a little bit vague here, but I'm trying to explain that we know our head, we understand that ICH is important, but we just don't really know exactly what we can do to genuinely preserve ICH, and we don't really connect with that. So I myself am a student interested in this, and this is literally my major, but I know it's important, but I don't know exactly what I should do to try to establish a connection in preserving ICH. And it will be even worse for other young people who are not studying this as their major. So to have that responsibility or a sense of commitment, I think that we have to appeal to the youth through an emotional sense, and they need to establish an emotional connection with ICH. And I think that will help them to see that instead of vaguely thinking, oh yeah, this is something that's important, they can really take the next voluntary step to actually safeguard those elements. In my presentation, we talked about establishing this connection, and this is a sort of emotional connection. And to do so, I think we need an ICH youth network, like we said in our presentation. If there's a network, then maybe we can raise this awareness more concretely, because otherwise there's just this vague idea of ICH safeguarding, and I think we need something more concrete. Yes, thank you very much. I think that means that you have more of a sense of responsibility to try to help the youth establish an emotional connection with ICH. So now we'd like to listen to our speakers on that common question that I asked. I think that Dr. Anita also responded to that already with the new normal and what's going to happen in the new normal after post-corona, what's going to happen, what should we do in terms of safeguarding and transmitting ICH in the new normal post-COVID. Who would you like to respond? Eric?
Well, from the government side, we have always established this tradition of a school of living tradition. So this is specialized school, particularly in specific areas all over the country. It covers around, I think now, all over 200 schools of living tradition supported by our national government. And this is a school where young children, the youth, are exposed to the traditions of the communities. Very often, these are indigenous communities. Now, the biggest challenge here is in this post-COVID or maybe the new normal, it may not be as convenient to gather in these schools of living tradition. There are many constraints that they have to address, particularly they cannot meet anymore. Technology should be there. And if they are in the mountains, it's very difficult to get an internet or a Wi-Fi connection. At the same time, many of the schools of tradition are really situated in the landscape. So there's a very strong connection that the inspiration of the crafts, of the arts, even the songs have been sourced from the landscape. But the landscape is very rapidly changing. So there's also an emerging disconnection and dichotomy between those two concepts. Now, more than anything, I think as an intangible heritage phenomenon, as the youth, the Korean youth has mentioned earlier, that this will continually evolve. It's continually recreated. And I'm very, very confident that maybe we are concerned about this, but as a people, as a community, as a group, as an individual, because there's ICH, they will always survive. They will always be survivors, and they will know exactly how to navigate and negotiate with this particular rupture in our society and our environment. So thank you.
네, 좀 더 정확한 또
Yes, I think that maybe we can hear a little bit more from Dr. Mitchell. Would you like to respond to that common question about what's going to happen in the new normal era?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest with you, I don't know what the new normal is. I'm hoping that what we're living in right now doesn't become the normal, and we get back to something more like a life that we had been living. The interesting thing about the lack of jobs in Fiji for many of the communities that had migrated through urban drift, and they left the islands to move to the cities, largely to get education for the children, the modern first world education. But without jobs, some of them are moving back to the remote islands. And so there's perhaps a reconnection with the heritage in that regard. I think the question raised by the Korean youth about, trying to have that connection, if the youth don't have the connection with the elders who have practiced it as just part of their life, passed down through the centuries and the millennia, it's hard to just recreate it through book learning or class learning. It's that contact with the elders. And so in Fiji, the families leaving the small islands to move to the city for education for their children has disconnected the youth from their grandparents and great uncles and so forth. And so the community effort to maintain certain traditions has been frayed to a large extent. But as my understanding is that some of them are moving back to the islands, and so perhaps that'll reestablish a little bit better the cultural link. In the end, I think it is about individuals that are willing, and the younger individuals that are willing to engage in a dedicated way to maintain the tangible cultural heritage, because everyone's not going to do it. When the community required the boats 200, 300, 1,000 years ago to sail, they had no other option. They had to have the culture maintained and the storytelling to build the boats. Now they've got other options, and people are going to choose the other options the modern way. And the question is, how do you keep that unbroken chain of knowledge passing down? And it's through practice. And maybe not all individuals will do it, but my great gratitude to those youth who do take that onto themselves to carry that forward. Thanks.
네, 감사합니다. 아무래도
Thank you very much. I think that going into the new normal era, on how we're going to practice and safeguard and transmit ICH, it's going to be really a challenge for all of us. And that is definitely something that we have to consider going forward. We do have another question to the youth. And I know that there were some of the online audiences who also asked some questions, and they also had some questions for the youth as well. So I'm going to take all those and try to integrate that into one question. So the question is this: is Korea doing its best on a national level to encourage and foster the establishment of an ICH youth network? So is Korea doing its best on a governmental level? Because in the presentation, you guys are pretty critical about the fact that a lot of the support is one-off. So can you perhaps respond to that? Yes, I think I made eye contact with someone, so I think you're it. So your question is about the current status right now in Korea. So the Seoul Metropolitan Government also has a committee. I don't exactly know what the exact wording is, but there's a committee that encourages a youth activity for cultural properties. And there's also some sort of public sector committees and commissions like this kind. But if we were to just narrow in and zoom in on ICH, I don't think there is a public committee or a governmental commission or even a network of researchers on ICH. I think that there is definitely a lack there in Korea. And I do want to respond to the common question that the moderator raised. So when we go into the new normal, even if we go back to the old normal, I think that what happened right now, because of COVID-19, that's going to bring about a massive amount of changes in our society. And in the midst of those changes, I think that communication and cooperation are going to be even more important down the road. So for example, the youth around the world, we know that there are many young people around the world who are interested in ICH, that they are working on ICH safeguarding, but because of language barriers or maybe other different challenges, there was a limit to the amount of information we could gather. But now because of COVID-19, we're all doing everything contactless. We're all doing everything virtually. So a lot of the discussions are held in the online realm. And this allows us to engage in actually even more communication and cooperation. And this was made possible because of COVID-19. So hopefully maybe this could go later to more promotion and safeguarding activities for ICH. Yes, thank you very much. I think there was one question for Dr. Anita Vaivade. Yes, I think this is from one of the online audience members. So can you share with us any good best practices around the world where environmental law and ICH safeguarding have been brought together into one law to have some sort of synergy between the two? Any best practices?
Yes, in fact, honestly, we find these connections to be really, really dispersed. it's quite difficult to find it, as in the question it was asked, to have this connection in one single legal document. We see those connections dispersed. Let's say in environmental law, we see interest in traditional practices, or in the legislation which deals with intangible cultural heritage, we see the importance of natural spaces and their access. But these connections are not really articulated in one single legal document. So that is also part of the, in fact, difficulty to understand these junction points in different countries, because we need to reach out to these diverse legal documents and see how they are interconnected and where these junction points can be found. But one of the, let's say, good practice that we can definitely identify, I think it's in those cases where there is customary laws which are dealing with the management of natural resources and natural spaces. And in those cases, if those customs are being respected within the legal system in the country, I think that is definitely a good practice to follow there where that is relevant as a junction point. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your response. Today is actually the last day of the forum. And the topic that we're dealing with today is intangible cultural heritage in our daily lives towards a new age. The overarching theme was human nature and ICH, especially NIHC and UNESCO ICHCAP. Because they're here, do you have any final messages that you want to deliver to these organizations? Dr. Eric, do you have any message for our organizers? So this is a common question across all of the four speakers.
Well, I just feel that the intangible cultural heritage will continue to develop and to be evolving. And I think it's also very important, particularly the platform of the youth, that they also have to be introduced, to be made aware, to really intensify their appreciation with regards to this human phenomenon, because it is the one that connects us to our world, to our environment, to the universe, and also it connects us to our histories. I just want to impress that it's really the ICH that provides the narrative of our lives. And it is very important that we develop this because it provides us the memory that will carry on to our sustainability and our continuity. Thank you very much.
예, 이번에
Thank you very much. Can we go to Dr. Mitchell now? Do you have a message for the organizers?
Yeah, I really like the sort of a theme throughout that human intangible cultural heritage is linked to the human interface to nature. And, you know, one of the themes that all indigenous people have had or practice, you know, belief system was the fundamental oneness of between human society or humans in their environment. And, you know, we've become disconnected. You know, in the case of the small example that I gave of these sailing canoes, you know, that culture has to exist in the context of humans communicating with each other. And if you're on remote islands in very small community, the only way they could communicate with other islands and other small communities was through building a boat and sailing. So it was really a fundamental emblem of the connectivity. And it was fundamentally embedded within nature. They had to sail across a dangerous ocean to get to the other side. So I think what I'm trying to get at here is that these practices that humans have developed, how they interact with nature and how they interact with the way humans can communicate with each other is is a challenge that I feel like modern society has created so many different distractions for us that we no longer, have those anymore. And so in terms of maintaining this going forward and in terms of the tangible cultural heritage and sustainability, I think we can learn a lot from what the ancient people, the great ancestors of all human cultures around the world already knew. And as an ecologist, we actually work with the Fijian elders about the stories that they have about their natural resource and their management. Because if you put it in the context of their story, they're more willing to accept the modern ecology point of view. So there's a lot of knowledge there. And, but I do worry about the loss. And I think it has a lot to do with we're losing connection instead of building connection across the different, I feel especially between the generations, the older people and the youth, and losing the connection, we lose the intangible cultural heritage, and we lose the connection to nature too. Thanks.
예, 아니타 교수님.
Yes, Dr. Anita Vaivare.
Thank you. I really appreciated what was said also earlier during the discussion about reconnection to cultural heritage, but then also reconnection to our local natural environment. We do sometimes speak about local communities as being a specific part of society, but in the end, we are all locals in the place where we are and where we live. And I think the present circumstances that we faced all around the world during these months, they really encouraged, in fact, people to discover their local environments, their local nature. We have heard on media that people are really going out, exploring the nature, exploring natural parks, regional parks, and being in nature nearby, in fact, their homes. And I think that could be an added value that we could bring with us in a way to continue to value our local natural environment and the way it influences also the way our cultural identities are being shaped. So I do believe and I do hope that this will have a long-term influence also on the way how we dwell in the places where we live. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Listening to our three presenters, I think that ICH, or Intangible Cultural Heritage, is really, truly very important. And it's so important, and we have a responsibility to pass that on to the later generations, and that means that there's more of a responsibility on the shoulders of the youth. So perhaps maybe we can turn to these young students here, ICH Youth Network. Do you have a message for the organizers for NIHC or ICHCAP? Maybe you want to ask them to organize some more sessions for the youth. So for the National Intangible Heritage Center and UNESCO ICHCAP, I know that the two organizations are really working very hard, both domestically and internationally, on the safeguarding and transmission of ICH. And I think that their roles are very important in that regard. We're very proud of the work that the NIHC and ICHCAP are doing. And I know that you're working really hard domestically, but if I were to just ask maybe one favor from the organizers is to try to do more outreach to more members of society. So maybe not just a particular segment of society, but even maybe the youth, even teenagers, even very young children, even very young students, and also all the way up to our seniors. Maybe you can reach out to members of all different societal populations within our Korea, within our country. In Korea, we do have this system of safeguarding cultural properties, but I think that's great. But we want to try to expand that thinking on ICH and maybe provide more support going beyond that government system on safeguarding cultural properties. Thank you very much for that. So today we have had this session themed on nature and ICH. I think that more so than tangible cultural heritage, intangible cultural heritage is really under threat. The threat can come from various areas like COVID-19, climate change, various different natural phenomena and physical changes, and also people's lack of interest on ICH, and also maybe even the effects of globalization. But despite that, ICH, intangible cultural heritage, is something that is living and breathing. It is a set of elements that are alive, which is why we call them living culture. So obviously, ICH is very important. And through discussions like these and more, we want to try to raise awareness about the importance of ICH and rethink the value of ICH. We did have a lot of questions from our online audience members. We're sorry if we left out any of the questions, but I do want to thank the presenters and our audience members online who have stayed with us until the end. And with that, so we would like to conclude the third session for the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Yoon Gum-jin, President of the Cultural Foundation of National Museum of Korea. And I'd like to thank all of the four speakers. For the last 3 days, we have had the World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage. And I would like to thank the audience as well as the relevant officials for their very hard work. The world is here to disseminate the value of ICH and discuss ways to safeguard ICH. And the journey continues on as we speak. Especially this World Forum, despite various difficulties out there, really focus on the importance of communication and solidarity of communities, as well as the power of cooperation in opening a new era. And also with that hope, we discover the wisdom and vision of ICH in redefining the relationship between human and nature. This very moment, wherever you may be, all of you are working tirelessly to help the world overcome the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you very much for your hard work, and also to online participants for their active engagement during the session. Thank you very much. So we hope to see you again at next year's World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage. This finally concludes the 2020 World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage. Thank you very much.